Because the Book of Abraham parallels so many non-biblical stories about Abraham, it is clearly of the same tradition. The majority of these non-biblical traditions were not available to the prophet Joseph Smith during his lifetime. The late John Twetness, Brian Hauglid, and John Gee, Brigham Young University professors specializing in Hebrew, Middle Eastern studies, and Egyptology. Going through a list of Abraham's sources with their dates of publication is one way of showing how recent most of the stuff is, and how highly improbable it is that Joseph Smith could have made use of any of it. The late Hugh Nibley, formerly Brigham Young University professor of ancient scripture. The critics charges that Joseph Smith borrowed and adapted popular ideas in the production of Latter-day Saint scripture and doctrine are unfounded in the case of the Book of Abraham. Andrew Hedges, Brigham Young University professor of church history and doctrine. The stories and worldviews we find in the translated text of our Book of Abraham coincide nicely with what we find from ancient Abrahamic lore. Joseph Smith could only have received this information through revelation, since there were no resources available to him on many of these traditions. Fair Mormon, Foundation for Apologetic Information and Research. Hi, I'm Dan Vogel. In the previous videos, I've occasionally discussed possible 19th century sources of inspiration for Joseph Smith's dictation of his pretended translation of the Book of Abraham. In this video, I will examine the first two chapters, which Joseph Smith dictated in Ohio in 1835. I will also discuss his interpretation of Facsimile 1, which, after all, was his main source of inspiration. In the following presentation, I deal with apologetic attempts to support the Book of Abraham's antiquity by drawing parallels between it and ancient Egyptian, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources. Though these parallels are weak, misrepresented, or irrelevant, the apologists grossly overestimate the significance of their evidence and underestimate what Joseph Smith's contemporaries knew about the non-biblical legends about Abraham. In the previous videos, I discussed Joseph Smith's identification of 4 Egyptian mummies in his possession, 2 of which he said were King Onitis and Princess Ketumen. This information he obtained by pretending to translate characters from a now missing papyrus owned by a man named Amenhotep. I showed how in July 1835 he started to translate the Book of Abraham from the Book of Breathings, once owned by a priest named Hor, but interrupted this dictation to compile an alphabet and then a grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, where he pretended to give translations of random characters. I also showed how in November 1835 he returned to his dictation of his pretended translation of the Book of Abraham. This means that there was a delay of 5 months, wherein he brainstormed under the guise of compiling a grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, some of which he used in his subsequent dictation of the Book of Abraham. During this time, Smith may have also consulted Bible commentaries, such as Adam Clarke's well-known commentary and other theological books. By the end of November 1835, Smith had dictated to Abraham chapter 2, verse 18. The remainder of the Book of Abraham would not be dictated until March 1842, giving Smith even more time to contemplate. There is evidence that Smith was thinking about the Book of Abraham prior to his 1842 resumption of the translation. On the 9th of March 1841, a full year before dictating Abraham chapters 3 through 5, Smith preached on the Godhead, explaining that these personages, according to Abraham's record, are called God the First, the Creator, God the Second, the Redeemer, and God the Third, the Witness or Testator. While this information doesn't appear in the Book of Abraham, it shows that Smith not only had plenty of time to think about his pseudepigraphic text, but that he thought of it much as a pseudepigraphist would, that is, as a means of lending ancient authority to his own ideas about theology. Because I dealt with the 19th century context of the Book of Abraham's discussion of the cosmos, and premortal intelligences in Part 5, and the influence of Joseph Smith's Hebrew lessons on Abraham's account of the creation in Part 6, this video will focus on the first 2 chapters of Abraham, paying particular attention to places where the book of Abraham differs from Genesis. In 2001, the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, otherwise known as FARMS, based at Mormon-owned Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, published a 553-page tome titled Traditions About the Early Life of Abraham, a collection of rather late Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources supposedly supporting the antiquity of the Book of Abraham. This compilation was created by 3 scholars associated with Brigham Young University: John Twetness, a specialist in Hebrew; Brian Hauglid, a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic; and John Gee, an Egyptologist. Included in this volume is a 10-page index titled Unique Elements of the Book of Abraham, supported by extra-biblical traditions. This index is arranged into 8 categories such as idolatry in Abraham's day, sacrifice of Abraham and others, famine in Khaldiya, and so on. These 8 categories are divided into 40 subcategories. The apologetic nature of this work is clearly announced at the beginning of the volume, where the authors assert, because the Book of Abraham parallels so many non-biblical stories, it is clearly of the same tradition. One might dismiss a single element found in a non-biblical tradition that parallels the Book of Abraham as mere coincidence. However, when a large number of such elements come together from diverse times and places, they overwhelmingly support the Book of Abraham as an ancient text. There are far too many references to Terah as an idolater, Abraham as a sacrificial victim, Abraham as an astronomer, and Abraham as a missionary to lightly dismiss their antiquity. The majority of these non-biblical traditions were not available to the prophet Joseph Smith during his lifetime. While we think these traditions provide substantial evidence that the Book of Abraham is an ancient text, we realize that others may not find the evidence convincing. Count me as one of those who question their evidence, for, in fact, these so-called unique elements in the Book of Abraham just named, that Abraham's father Terah was an idolater, that Abraham was a victim of an attempted sacrifice, that Abraham was an astronomer, or that he was a missionary and made converts in Haran, were all known to Joseph Smith's contemporaries, as will be discussed in the following video. While this is the case, it does not necessarily mean that Joseph Smith plagiarized these sources. However, the discovery that Joseph Smith's contemporaries had access to the same Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions about Abraham, and that they were more widely known than previously assumed, will stand as a corrective to the claims of Mormon apologists like Twetness, Hauglid, and Gee. In my analysis, I begin with Abraham chapter 2, because it parallels Genesis chapters 11 and 12, and there is much to learn about Joseph Smith's methodology from the ways in which Abraham reads differently. The first thing to notice about chapter 2 of the book of Abraham is that Abraham receives 2 revelations, wherein God commands Abraham to depart, one in Ur, located in Chaldea, and another in Haran, located in northern Mesopotamia, whereas in Genesis, only the latter is mentioned. However, Stephen's words to the Jewish Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7 assigned the appearance of God to Abraham and command to depart to Ur rather than Haran. And Stephen said, Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said unto him, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. This situation evidently caused a controversy in Joseph Smith's day over whether Abraham received 1 or 2 calls. According to Adam Clarke, there is great dissension between commentators concerning the call of Abraham, some supposing he had 2 distinct calls, others that he had but 1. Clarke conjectures that when Terah, Abraham, Lot, and their new wives left Ur, This was no doubt in consequence of some divine admonition. Under Acts 7 verse 2, Clark writes, "It seems most probable that Abraham had two calls, one in Ur and the other in Haran." In Abraham chapter 2, we see Joseph Smith attempting to resolve this well-known conflict by creating two calls. In creating the first call in Ur, Smith borrowed the wording from Genesis chapter 12 verse 1, which was the call Abraham later received in Haran. "Now the Lord had said unto me, Abraham, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." For the second calling, Smith created 3 new verses to replace Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 instead of repeating it. "But I, Abraham, and Lot, my brother's son, prayed unto the Lord, and the Lord appeared unto me, and said unto me, Arise, and take Lot with thee, for I have proposed to take thee out of Haran, and to make of thee a minister to bear my name in a strange land, which I will give unto thy seed after thee, for an everlasting possession, when they hearken to my voice." And then he continued with the remainder of Abraham's call in verses 2 and 3 of Genesis 12, expanding them much the same way as he had done during his Bible revision. In attempting to resolve the problem of 2 Abrahamic callings, Smith was forced to make other adjustments to the Genesis account. The statement in Genesis 11:31 that Terah took Abraham, Lot, and their wives to Haran could no longer stand, since Smith made God command Abraham to leave Ur. So instead of saying, Terah took Abraham and the others, Smith changed it to read, I left the land of Ur, and I took Lot and the others, and also my father followed after me. This created a problem of explaining Terah's motivation for following Abraham, given the fact that in chapter 1, he is an idolater and seeks to kill Abraham. So Smith has Terah repent, at least long enough to get him to Haran, as Genesis requires. The reason for his repentance is a famine, apparently the same one mentioned later in the account in Genesis 12:10, when Abraham is in Canaan, which forces him to move farther south into Egypt. Smith expanded both the duration and the location of the famine to include Khaldiya and northern Mesopotamia, and had it begin much earlier when Abraham was still in Ur. The famine was invented in the first chapter of Abraham as God's retribution for attempting to sacrifice Abraham. Smith uses it to explain the death of Abraham's brother Haran, whereas in Genesis no cause is given. In Abraham, the famine causes Terah to repent, but when the famine abated in Haran, he returned to his former practice. When the book of Abraham mentions the famine in Canaan, it becomes a continuation of the famine. It was necessary to maintain one long famine that briefly abates, rather than creating a second famine in order to harmonize with Genesis 26:1, which mentions a famine in the days of Isaac, stating that there was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. These changes did not appear in Smith's 1831 revision of the early chapters of Genesis, but these kinds of changes would fit comfortably with the revisions he had made in his so-called Bible translation. The purpose of my discussion is to show that there are larger issues and more immediate concerns in Joseph Smith's environment that help shape the text of the Book of Abraham that need to be considered before we assess the value of the apologists' isolated parallels to the ancient world. As I have shown, the Book of Abraham's use of Genesis is very little different than what we see in Smith's Bible revision, where it is becoming increasingly clear that he was responding to perceived problems in the English translation of the King James Version, rather than to some underlying original or ancient texts. Of the parallels the apologists have offered for chapter 2 of the Book of Abraham, the following are the most significant. There was a famine in Abraham's homeland of Khaldiya. Of the 11 sources Tuetnus, Hauglid, and Guy offer, all but one date to between the 1st and 14th centuries CE. One, the Book of Jubilees, dates to the 2nd century BCE. 2 of the sources are irrelevant. Two other sources deal with a chronologically problematic legend about Abraham and Nimrod competing to feed the people during a famine, with Nimrod drawing on his many storehouses and Abraham providing grain by a miracle. 6 sources deal with another legend about Abraham praying for ravens, crows, or birds to stop eating the seeds that the farmers simply throw on the ground, causing a scarcity of food. Abraham then teaches the people how to plow and plant the seeds under the earth. 3 references in the Midrash dating to the 4th and 5th centuries CE merely state that there were 2 famines in Abraham's day. One commentator in Joseph Smith's day noted that there was a chronological problem with the legends describing Abraham and Nimrod as contemporaries. In 1828, Algernon Herbert, in his book titled Nimrod, a discourse on certain passages of history and fable, wrote, "Although Nimrod was only the 4th in descent from Noah inclusive, and though it is not insinuated that he was ever an old man, and although Abraham was the 11th in descent from Noah, the Jews have harbored the strange notion of their having been contemporaries, and describe victories of Abraham over Nimrod and persecutions of him by the same tyrant." Herbert speculated that the Nimrod of these fables must be titled King of Nations, who was Abraham's contemporary. Regardless, the famine happens in these legends, dating to the 13th and 14th centuries CE, before Nimrod attempts to execute Abraham by casting him into a furnace, whereas in the book of Abraham the reverse is the case, since the famine is God's punishment of the Chaldeans for attempting to kill Abraham. Likewise, the raven story happens when Abraham is 14 or 15 years old, which is before the attempted execution of Abraham, and creates 2 famines in Abraham's day, contrary to Genesis 26:1. The Midrash thrice states that there were 2 famines in the days of Abraham, probably based on the crow story in Jubilees, which takes place before Abraham burns the idols. Clearly, none of these legends mentioning a famine in Khaldiya support the Book of Abraham's account of a famine appearing in retribution for the attempted sacrifice of Abraham. Abraham prayed that God would end the famine in Khaldiya. Abraham's praying to end the famine in Abraham chapter 2 verse 17 doesn't happen while Abraham is in Ur, as all the apologists' sources state, but rather years later after Abraham has left Haran and is about to enter Canaan. There he builds an altar and prays that the famine might be turned away from my father's house, which was located in Haran. Haran died in the famine. The apologists give just one source for Haran dying in the famine, but it's really a 14th century CE source about Haran dying in a fire. Why the apologists chose this one source is not clear, since there are several accounts of Haran dying accidentally in the fire Abraham builds in which to burn the idols. Still, they have given us no support for the Book of Abraham's account of Haran dying in the famine. Terah, after repenting, returned to his idols. Of the 11 sources listed by the apologists, only 2 clearly state Terah turned from his idolatry, but for very different reasons than the Book of Abraham. Instead of Terah being humbled by the famine, as Abraham chapter 1 verse 30 states, it is because in one source he sees Abraham miraculously delivered from Nimrod's furnace, and in another because Noah and Shem, chronologically impossible, persuade him to do so. As previously mentioned, Genesis had Terah take Abraham and the others to Haran for no specific reason. When Smith created 2 callings and departures by divine command, Abraham was made to lead the family out of Ur. Having Terah repent temporarily was Joseph Smith's way of explaining why Terah followed Abraham to Haran. Abraham made converts in Haran. Genesis 12 verse 5 states that when Abraham left Haran for Canaan, that among other things, he took the souls they had gotten in Haran. Abraham 2 verse 15 changed this to read, "The souls we had won in Haran," which made it sound like those Abraham had converted. Commenting on Genesis 12 verse 5, Adam Clarke stated, "This may apply either to the persons who were employed in the service of Abraham, or to the persons he had been the instrument of converting to the knowledge of the true God." And in this latter sense, the Chaldee paraphrasts understood the passage, translating it, "the souls of those whom they proselyted in Haran." So it is not surprising that our apologists include among those they quote the very paraphrasts referred to by Clarke. Joseph Smith merely made the passage in Genesis less ambiguous. Abraham was 62 years of age when he left Haran, not 75 as Genesis says. Our apologists try to make a big deal of this, but it is really quite unremarkable, given the fact that Joseph Smith changed the ages of the patriarchs in the Bible revision without any apparent reason for doing so. None of the examples the apologists give say Abraham was 62 when he left Haran, which would be a remarkable coincidence. Instead, they give ages 37, 52, 60, 65, 70, 75, and 80. Obviously, summarizing the work of Tvetnes, Hauglid, and Guy, the recent position paper at LDS.org asserts that the Book of Abraham is supported by ancient traditions located across the Near East, including Abraham's being 62 years old when he left Haran, not 75 as the biblical account states, which is patently false. Now that we have seen Joseph Smith's creative approach to Genesis, how he responds to problems he perceives in the text, moving passages around and creating new material to fill gaps, I turn to chapter 1, where he creates a story inspired by Facsimile 1. In fact, Facsimile 1 is mentioned twice in the text, once for the likeness of the bedstead or altar upon which Abraham was placed for sacrifice, and once for the representation of the gods that appear under the altar. So, Joseph Smith tells us the source of his inspiration. To Smith, this partly intact vignette looked like human sacrifice, and no doubt the attempted sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham came to mind, where Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son, but God called out to him to stop. At some point after the vignette was mounted on thick paper, someone drew a knife in the priest's right hand. But later in Nauvoo, in consultation with Joseph Smith, Reuben Hedlock made a printing plate with the knife in the left hand. Nevertheless, Tvetnes, Hauglid, and Guy attempt to support the Book of Abraham's account by drawing on 58 early Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources where Abraham is thrown into a furnace or onto a pyre, most often at the order of Nimrod. Thus, their index subheading ambiguously reads, "Abraham was brought to be killed or sacrificed because he would not worship idols." Attempting to overcome the obvious weakness of this parallel, Mormon Egyptologist Carrie Milstein observes that most non-canonical ancient traditions held that Abraham was to be burned, while the Book of Abraham spoke of an altar, though it never specifies how he was to be killed on the altar. Facsimile 1 indicates a knife was being used. What I found in the few cases of Egyptian sacrifice, human or not, about which we have details, is that typically the sacrificial victim was to be struck with a blade and then burned. This is likely what was intended for Abraham as well. This apologetic interpretation is pure nonsense. None of those non-canonical sources has Abraham stabbed or slashed with a knife before being thrown into the fire. He is simply thrown into the fire alive, and a miraculous power preserves him until he emerges. More importantly, in these sources, Abraham is actually thrown into the fire, whereas in the Book of Abraham, that does not happen. The fact is, these sources do not in any way provide support for the Book of Abraham. Besides, they were well known to Joseph Smith's contemporaries. The story is very much like the three Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in chapter 3 of the book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has them thrown into the furnace for not worshiping the golden image. Adam Clarke comments that the furnace was an ancient mode of punishment among the Chaldeans, if we may credit the tradition that Abraham was cast into such a fire by this idolatrous people because he would not worship their idols. As early as the 18th century, English poet and scholar Abraham Cowley said, "Some of the Jews tell a ridiculous fable that Abraham and Haran, his brother, were cast by the Chaldeans into a burning furnace for opposing their idolatry, in which Haran was consumed, but Abraham was preserved." This information was readily available to Joseph Smith's contemporaries through various dictionaries and encyclopedias in Europe and America. A new complete English dictionary published in London in 1760, for example, recounted the story of Abraham destroying his father's idols, and that Terah, being angry thereat, brought Abraham before Nimrod to be punished. That Nimrod, who was one of the Magi, commanded Abraham to worship the fire, and upon his refusal ordered him to be thrown into the burning furnace, but that Abraham came out unhurt. Mormon apologist Andrew Hedges is therefore not entirely correct when he asserts that none of these Bible commentators mentioned the available traditions concerning attempts to sacrifice Abraham himself. Once we understand that these apologists are attempting to support the Book of Abraham by comparing it to legends about the attempted burning of Abraham, the other elements they give in association with that execution become irrelevant. Consider the following. Children were sacrificed in the fire. Those who would not worship idols were killed by the fire. Abraham was fastened or bound before being thrown into the fire. When his life was in danger, Abraham prayed not to be burned. An angel came to rescue Abraham in the fire. God rescued Abraham from death by the fire. The altar, that is, the furnace, and the idols were destroyed in the fire. This last one needs more comment. The Book of Abraham states that as a result of the attempted sacrifice of Abraham, the Lord broke down the altar of Elkanah and of the gods of the land, and utterly destroyed them, whereas in the legends that supposedly support the Book of Abraham, Abraham is the one who either throws the idols into the fire or smashes them, which is why he was being executed. Other so-called parallels prove likewise irrelevant or misrepresented. The priest or leader was smitten and died. The Book of Abraham states that in retribution for the attempted sacrifice of Abraham, the Lord not only destroyed the altar and gods, but also smote the priest that he died. The legends to which the apologists refer either describe the flames of the furnace or pyre rising up into the face of the executioner, sometimes Nimrod, or subsequently a bug flying up Nimrod's nose and slowly eating his brain, causing madness until someone splits his head open and the bug flies out. In the Book of Abraham, it is the priest of Pharaoh who died, not Pharaoh, and not from the fire of the furnace. Not to mention Nimrod with a bug up his nose. This accounts for 7 of the 21 sources. 8 are irrelevant because they describe Abraham's brother, Haran, being killed by the fire Abraham set to destroy the idols. 2 sources are too vague to be meaningful. 2 describe Nimrod being killed when a tower collapses. 1 describes the fire at Abraham's execution getting out of control and killing 83,000 people. And 1 claims the ground opened up and swallowed one of Abraham's accusers before Nimrod ordered Abraham to be thrown into the fire. It is easy to see that none of these sources in any way support the Book of Abraham's account. Terah was behind the attempt to kill Abraham. These apologists cite 7 sources in support of Terah's wanting to kill Abraham for destroying his gods. But the Book of Abraham doesn't say Abraham destroyed Terah's idols, only that Abraham's life was sought because he preached against idolatry, stating that his fathers, Terah being one of them, hearkened not unto my voice, but endeavored to take away my life by the hand of the priest of Elkanah. There is no account of Terah dragging Abraham before Pharaoh and demanding his execution for destroying his idols, which was the penalty for such an act. Rather, in the Book of Abraham, Abraham was being silenced by his own family by being offered up for a sacrifice. He was not being executed. Terah, Abraham's father, worshipped idols. It is surprising that these apologists list Terah's idolatry as one of their evidences in favor of the Book of Abraham, since it was so well known in Joseph Smith's day. For example, in a new complete English dictionary published in London in 1760, under Abram, it reads, Abram spent the first years of his life in his father's house, where they adored idols. Many are of opinion that he himself was at first engaged in this way of worship, but that God giving him better understanding, he renounced it. And for this reason, some believe, suffered a severe persecution from the Chaldeans, who threw him into a fiery furnace, from which God miraculously rescued him. Jewish writers tell us that Terah, Abraham's father, made and sold images or representations of sun, moon, and stars to worship, and that Abraham, being well skilled in the astronomy of those times, learned from thence that the heavenly bodies could neither make nor move themselves by their own power, but that there was one only God, who created, preserved, and governed all things, and that therefore they ought to worship him alone. The published minutes of an anti-Masonic convention held in Massachusetts in 1829 included the following statement about Abraham and his father. Those who did not immigrate with their venerable ancestor Shem fell under the tyranny of the idolatry of Nimrod, for the Bible informs us that Nahor, Terah, and perhaps Serug bowed to idols. This gave offense to Abraham. And in the absence of Terah one day, Abraham broke up his father's idols. This so enraged Terah that he accused Abraham before Nimrod to have him punished for condemning his gods. Despite knowledge of these non-canonical writings, Terah's idolatry has long been assumed based on Joshua 24 verse 2, which states that Terah, the father of Abraham, served other gods. This passage, along with Jewish legends available to Joseph Smith and his contemporaries through secondary sources, like the ones just quoted, makes such evidence very weak. Apologist and Egyptologist Carrie Muhlestein has long contended that the Egyptians in Abraham's day practiced human sacrifice, although challenges from other Egyptologists and scholars of the Near East have forced him to use equivocal terminology when trying to support the Book of Abraham. His 2003 dissertation at UCLA, for example, is titled Violence in the Service of Order, the Religious Framework for Sanctioned Killing. The term sanctioned killing is ambiguous and can be applied to human sacrifice or capital punishment. In his 2011 essay, Muhlestein admitted the lack of evidence for human sacrifice in Egypt. While the Egyptians may have had some kind of regular program of human sacrifice, slight bits of evidence suggest this, but there is no conclusive evidence. At the same time, they certainly did believe there were certain circumstances in which the only appropriate response was to ritually slay someone. Nevertheless, he can't resist resorting to ambiguous terminology, like ritually slay, to make it appear that the Book of Abraham is being supported. However, the Book of Abraham describes something more incredible because the human sacrifice that is being performed, after the manner of the Egyptians, occurred in the land of the Chaldeans, specifically in the land of Ur of the Chaldees, by the priest of Elkanah, who was also the priest of Pharaoh. As University of Chicago Egyptologist Robert Rittner noted, wherever one locates Ur of Chaldees, human sacrifice dictated there by priests of Pharaoh is unbelievable to credible scholars of the ancient Near East. Christopher Woods, Associate Professor of Sumerology in the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, responded to the Book of Abraham's claims. One of the more remarkable claims encountered in the Book of Abraham is the attestation of Egyptian religious and cultic practices at Ur. If we are correct in identifying Abraham's Ur, this poses grave difficulties for the account given in the Book of Abraham, as there is no evidence whatsoever for the cults of the purported Egyptian gods described in the narrative, or for established Egyptian religious practices more generally in the city. If we assume a northern location for Abraham's Ur, the prospects hardly improve. There is no evidence for the regular worship of Egyptian gods at Haran, or, for that matter, at any other location in northern Mesopotamia. Despite such grave difficulties, the apologists not only persist, but overstate their case. After explaining his theory about the knife, furnace, and possible human sacrifice, Milstein concludes, I discovered that thoroughly and correctly performing Egyptological research is a key to understanding the Book of Abraham. When we pull facts from carefully researched materials, they match perfectly with the information we received from Joseph Smith. It's difficult to imagine how he could be more wrong. Of course, there is a much simpler explanation, and that is that Joseph Smith simply assumed from Abraham's attempted sacrifice of Isaac that human sacrifice was common in Abraham's time. When Joseph Smith looked at facsimile 1, he had few interpretive options, that is, if he wanted to relate his translation to the Bible. Who among the patriarchs was associated with Egypt besides Moses? Abraham and Joseph, and they were immediately associated with the two scrolls. Connecting Abraham with facsimile 1 on the Book of Breathings was irresistible because it no doubt reminded him of the story of Abraham's attempted sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis. The text of Abraham refers the reader to facsimile 1 for a representation of the altar and 4 gods named in the text, no doubt referring to the 4 canopic jars under the lion couch, as well as a god like unto that of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, which in 1842 he associated with the crocodile at the bottom of the vignette. Commenting on the reference to Pharaoh in Exodus 1 verse 11, Adam Clarke said, It may be necessary to observe that all the Egyptian kings, whatever their own name was, took the surname Pharaoh when they came to the throne, a name which, in its general acceptation, signified the same as king or monarch, but in its literal meaning, as Bochart has amply proved, it signifies a crocodile, which being a sacred animal among the Egyptians, the word might be added to their kings in order to procure them the greater reverence and respect. Most Egyptologists identify facsimile 1 as depicting the reanimation of Osiris, which inclines them to restore the vignette in certain ways not supportive of Joseph Smith's reconstruction. While there are many examples of this, no two are exactly alike, as there are variations within the motif. In some, Osiris is mummified, while in others he is animated. If we go by other examples of this scene, the missing parts might be restored as follows. The priest's head should be that of a jackal, representing Anubis, the god of the dead. Part of Anubis's headdress can still be seen in the area of the right shoulder. The color and clothing is also consistent with Anubis. The knife would not be in the left hand. If anything, it would be a small urn. Instead of 2 hands raised to Osiris's face, some have argued that the upper fingers are really the tip of the wing of another bird, representing Isis hovering over Osiris, which can be seen in other similar vignettes. Milstein has attempted to defend Joseph Smith's reconstruction by arguing that facsimile 1 is different than what one might expect in a scene depicting the reanimation of Osiris. He notes that the person on the altar is neither mummified nor naked, as is typically the case with Osiris. More importantly, he states, the figure on the couch has 2 hands raised, in a position that almost certainly denotes a struggle. Whether or not the upper fingers are seen as a hand or the tips of Isis's wings, Milstein's assertion that 2 hands represent a defensive mode is highly unlikely, given the fact that there are many depictions of Osiris having 1 hand raised. How does 2 hands change what is being depicted? In other examples of this scene, other figures surround the couch having 2 hands raised, most certainly in the act of prayer, supplication, or praise. Note also that the person on the couch is not bound, although Joseph Smith's 1842 description says the image represents Abraham fastened upon an altar, and the Book of Abraham itself says, the angel unloosed my bands. Milstein's interpretation merely shows his bias and carries very little interpretive weight. Milstein has also claimed, we have found a papyrus depicting a person on a lion couch whom the Egyptians labeled as Abraham. This turns out to be incorrect. This papyrus Milstein refers to is a magical text dating to the 2nd century CE, written in Demotic and Greek, accompanying a drawing of a mummy attended by Anubis. But it doesn't say the mummy is Abraham, which doesn't fit the Book of Abraham anyway. Instead, as Rittner explained in 2014, the text is a love compulsion spell intended to force a woman to submit to a male's sexual lust, not a reflection of the Book of Abraham. The spell includes a string of names, among which is Abraham. However, as Rittner explains, it is no more relevant to the image than the other names in the string of magical names. Rittner therefore concludes, there is no intent here to represent a sacrifice, just Osiris tended by Anubis. The body on the lion bed is certainly that of the deceased Osiris, not a threatened Abraham. Without mentioning Rittner's criticism, Muhlestein subsequently admitted that he had misrepresented the Leiden magical papyrus, stating, I have misstated that the text of a particular papyrus said that it was Abraham on top of a lion couch, a scene that is similar to that on facsimile 1. However, the text did not say it was Abraham on top of the lion couch. Nevertheless, he still wants to use this source as evidence for the Book of Abraham. Muhlestein mentions only that Abraham's name appears below the vignette and neglects to discuss the full context. This means, Muhlestein states, that while we cannot be sure what the association between Abraham and the lion couch scene was, there was an intended association. The association of a lion couch with Abraham, whatever the nature of the association, is the point here. Well, it's a very small, hardly worth mentioning point, Carrie. Muhlestein also discusses one of the names in the Book of Abraham that he and other apologists believe supports its antiquity. The Book of Abraham mentions the altar that stood by the hill, called Potiphar's Hill, at the head of the plain of Olisham. When the place name Ulisham was discovered in two texts dating to about Abraham's time, Mormon apologists began touting it as evidence supporting the Book of Abraham, although it requires moving Ur from Chaldea in the south to a most unlikely location in northern Mesopotamia near Haran. In his 2011 essay, Muhlestein mentions the discovery of Ulisham and gleefully declares, the chances that Joseph Smith would make up a fictional outlandish place that turned out to be accurate in name, time, and location are too astronomical even to be considered. Professor Christopher Woods, who specializes in the ancient Near East, was less impressed by this evidence, stating in 2011, certainly, Ulisham could be superficially linked on phonetic grounds to the Olisham mentioned in the Book of Abraham in connection with the location of Ur of Chaldea, where Abraham's kin are said to have turned to the worship of Egyptian gods and Egyptian sacrificial rites. But convincing identification would have to be based on much more substantial evidence. Everything we know about the region during the period in question, not to mention the likely location of biblical Ur in southern Mesopotamia, speaks strongly against it. That the phonetic similarity is accidental, and here it should be pointed out that cuneiform sources attest thousands of place names, is again suggested by its coupling to the place Potiphar's Hill, which likewise is said to be in the land of Ur. Potiphar, of course, is the Egyptian official to whom Joseph is sold in Genesis. The name Potiphar is Egyptian in derivation, and has no place linguistically or culturally in the toponymy of southern or northern Mesopotamia. Finally, it must be observed that the identification of Ulisham with Olisham, alleged to be in the area of Ur, makes little geographic sense within the context of Abraham's travels from Ur to Haran and subsequently to Canaan, as described in Genesis and the Book of Abraham itself. For Ulisham no doubt lay west of Haran, and so the latter could in no way be considered to be en route from Ulisham to Canaan. Haran being diametrically in the wrong direction. Clearly, Muhlestein is much too confident and overstates the strength of his own evidence. Tvetnes, Hauglid, and Guy parallel non-canonical writings mentioning Abraham as a holder of the priesthood and the Book of Abraham's claim that Abraham had a right to the priesthood through his father's lineage. The Book of Abraham declares, I sought for the blessings of the fathers, and the right whereunto I should be ordained to administer the same. I became a rightful heir, a high priest, holding the right belonging to the fathers. As discussed in a previous video, Joseph Smith had tried to establish the handing down of the high priesthood through the patriarchs, including Abraham, as early as September 1832, when he dictated a revelation that included the following statement. Abraham received the priesthood from Melchizedek, who received it through the lineage of his fathers, even till Noah, and from Noah till Enoch, through the lineage of their fathers. In the months prior to the arrival of the papyri, Joseph Smith greatly expanded a revelation originally dictated in 1831, wherein he declared that the patriarchal priesthood was instituted in the days of Adam and came down by lineage, from father to son until Noah, the details of which were written in the book of Enoch, which are to be testified in due time. The book of Enoch never appeared. Instead, Joseph Smith seems to have made his case in the book of Abraham, which had the advantage of being physically accessible. It is therefore no accident that the first chapter of Abraham deals with Abraham's right to the priesthood through the patriarchs, which is contrasted with the illegitimate claim by the Egyptian pharaohs to the patriarchal priesthood through Ham's daughter, Egyptus. Thus, one 19th century source of inspiration for Joseph Smith's dictation of the Book of Abraham was his own revelations. This means that some of the ideas in the Book of Abraham had their own trajectory in Joseph Smith's theological development, apart from any parallels one might marshal from the ancient world. After all, as a pseudepigraphist, Smith had a purpose for dictating the text. Most of the non-canonical sources that Tvetnes, Hauglid, and Gies cite had a different reasoning for believing Abraham had the priesthood. Later Jews, it seems, struggled to explain how the patriarchs could build altars and offer sacrifice before Moses instituted the priesthood. They speculated that the patriarchs had authority, although they didn't actually hold the priesthood. As Midrash Rabbah, which is a rabbinic commentary on the 5 books of Moses and a few others, dating to at least the 5th century CE, explained, the priesthood, surely, was not given to any man until Aaron arose. What then is the meaning of the statement here? And he, Melchizedek, was priest, because he offered sacrifices like priests. Shem, who was identified as Melchizedek in Jewish tradition, died and handed it on to Abraham. But was Abraham a firstborn? The fact is that because he was a righteous man, the birthright was transferred to him, and he offered sacrifices. According to this source, Abraham acted like a priest, but wasn't a priest. In another place, the same source says Rabbi Ishmael holds that Abraham was a high priest. This was based on an unlikely reading of Psalms 110 verse 4. The Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Based on Hebrews 7, Christian commentators interpreted this passage as a reference to Christ's priesthood, whereas the rabbis naturally interpreted this as a reference to Abraham's receiving the priesthood from Melchizedek. Commenting on Psalms 110, Adam Clarke wrote, the Jews, aware of the advantage which the Christian religion must derive from this psalm, have labored hard and in vain to give it a contrary sense. Some have attributed Psalms 110 to Eliezer, the servant or steward of Abraham, and state that he composed it on the occasion of his master's victory over the 4 kings at the valley of Sheva. Christian scholars also struggled to explain animal sacrifice before Moses. 18th century English theologian Joseph Story, in his book, An Essay Concerning the Nature of the Priesthood, wrote, after the flood, Noah ministered as a priest when he went out of the ark. Abraham also exercised the same office, although the youngest brother. He built an altar, erected groves, and called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, and offered a ram for a burnt offering. And yet, Abraham is nowhere called a priest. Jacob also, the younger brother, in the lifetime of his father Isaac, offered sacrifice. Before Aaron was appointed, Moses performed the part of a priest. Needless to say, such statements by the rabbis and Christian theologians were merely speculations attempting to overcome problems they perceived in the biblical text and have no historical relevance. Joseph Smith merely took these speculations a step farther by inserting them into his pseudepigraphic works. The final item I will deal with is the claim in the Book of Abraham that Abraham had in his possession records that contained the chronology running back from myself to the beginning of the creation, for the records have come down into my hands, which I hold unto this present time, and that the records of the fathers, even the patriarchs, concerning the right of the priesthood, the Lord my God preserved in mine own hands. These records would certainly include the Book of Enoch, mentioned in Joseph Smith's recent expansion of his 1831 revelation. Twetness, Hauglid, and Guy cite several sources that mention multiple books of Abraham, as well as the writings of Enoch and Noah. Of course, the prophecy of Enoch is mentioned in Jude 1, verse 14, and other missing books and writings are mentioned in various other places in the Bible. The handing down of records from one prophet to the next is a well-established claim in Joseph Smith's teachings, beginning with the Book of Mormon. Pertaining to the writings of Abraham, Joseph Smith chose Abraham and Joseph because he had few options. Nevertheless, Joseph Smith's contemporaries discussed Abraham's writings. As early as 1760, a new complete English dictionary said under Abraham, Abraham is also said to be the author of several works. He is said to be the author of that famous book mentioned in the Talmud and highly valued by the rabbins called Yetzirah, or the Creation, of which it treats. There is also an apocalypse attributed to him by the Scythians. His assumption is mentioned by St. Athanasius. And Origen tells us of an apocryphal book said to be written by him, wherein two angels, a good and bad one, are introduced, disputing about his salvation or damnation. The Jews make him also the composer of some prayers and of the 19th Psalm, and a treatise against idolatry. This statement about Abraham is repeated in other dictionaries in Europe and America. The first source is Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Creation, 6th century CE, which Twetness, Hauglid, and Guy include in their compilation, stating that many early commentators and other books of Kabbalah attribute its authorship to Abraham. The next source is probably the Apocalypse of Abraham, dating to the 1st or 2nd century CE, also included in the Twetness, Hauglid, Guy volume. The apocryphal book mentioned by Origen is probably the Testament of Abraham, dating to the 1st or 2nd century CE, which is not included in the Twetness, Hauglid, Guy volume, but much discussed by Hugh Nibley. The Assumption of Abraham, mentioned by Athanasius, is probably also the Testament of Abraham, but considered here as a separate work. According to Charles Buck's well-known theological dictionary published in Philadelphia in 1826, the Muslims believe there are 104 sacred books, and that 10 were given to Adam, 50 to Seth, 30 to Idris or Enoch, 10 to Abraham. In his famous 1829 debate with skeptic Robert Owen, Alexander Campbell, the founder of the Disciples of Christ, said, "But Dr. Hyde and the most learned antiquarians present documental proof that the Persians retained the true history of the creation, of the antediluvian age, and so attached were the Persians to the religion of Abraham, that the sacred book which contains their religion is called Sohi Ibrahim, that is, the Book of Abraham." The idea that Abraham wrote books is less important than the fact that there is no evidence that he wrote this particular book, especially if we consider the claim that it was written by his own hand upon papyrus. In this video, I have shown that some of Joseph Smith's contemporaries knew the content of these early Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions about Abraham, but it is pointless to debate whether or not Joseph Smith knew about these sources, since most of them would not have been helpful to him anyway. The sacrifice of Abraham, the central theme of Abraham chapter 1, was inspired by facsimile 1, and chapter 2 was his reworking of Genesis chapters 11 and 12. Most importantly, the Book of Abraham served Joseph Smith's immediate interest in establishing the high priesthood among the ancient patriarchs. Later in Nauvoo, it will be used to establish his doctrine of a premortal existence for humans and a plurality of gods, which strangely is at odds with Abraham's iconoclastic monotheism. I don't know about you, but But I couldn't be less impressed with the evidence the apologists have tried to use to support the Book of Abraham's antiquity. Most of these ancient sources are only remotely similar to the Book of Abraham, or contain accounts that are completely different from what the Book of Abraham describes, like Abraham being thrown into the fire. Other parallels recount events in a completely different order than the Book of Abraham, like the famine beginning when Abraham was a child, instead of after the Chaldeans attempted to sacrifice him. In the first 7 videos of this series, we have seen how Joseph Smith pretended to translate Egyptian. Specifically, he pretended to translate the Book of Abraham from the breathing permit of Hor. The apologists have tried to overcome this evidence, but have failed. By no means should such parallels, no matter what one thinks of them, be used to override this clear evidence of deception. If Joseph Smith believed he was somehow inspired to dictate the Book of Abraham, he also believed he was authorized to use deception to promote it. I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for watching.